Well, quite a lot. We've come up with a model figure of around £9,000 per year. Now, this is just to show an order of magnitude. This is, of course, this will differ from household to household, but we're talking about substantial figures. That is the short summary. In housing, in particular, we could quite easily knock more than a third of the total cost of housing. In childcare, similar proportions. There, it could be between a third and maybe 40%. The cost of nanny state measures, the cost of lifestyle choices that the government disapproves of, that is mostly driven by policy. That is not the cost of the actual products. That is punitive taxation. In energy, the government policy is inflating costs through the green agenda and so some of the things that you've just mentioned in the previous segment. So we're talking about substantial numbers. Cost of living crisis doesn't come out of nowhere. This is to a very large extent under the control or something that policymakers could control.
So let's look at these issues one by one. An issue that has come up this week, of course, is housing. We've heard that Rishi Sunak wants to stop more houses being built on fields and only being done on brownfield land. I don't know how realistic that is, but your paper is suggesting quite the opposite, that there needs to be some deregulation in this sector in order to make housing more affordable.
Yes, absolutely. And this is an area which is really ripe for reform and has been for a long time. Brownfield, that is one of those policy myths that just will not go away. I mean, there really isn't enough brownfield land in the country, and a lot of it is, in addition, in the wrong place, and not all of it is developable. Some of it is contaminated and whatnot. So nobody is opposed to building on brownfield. Of course, where that is possible, where brownfield land is in the right place and where it can be built upon, of course it should be done. But the point is that is something that we've been doing for decades already anyway. It's not as if this was some kind of new solution. But it's greenbelt land actually that we have to look at, because a lot of greenbelt land is not particularly green. As you know, it's not the greenbelt is a misnomer. It's mislabeling. I think the term should be considered a form of false advertising, because it's land that doesn't have to be green. It doesn't have to be valuable from an environmental perspective or anything. It's not comparable to designations like areas of outstanding natural beauty or national parks or something like that. It's got nothing to do with that. It's just land that happens to be around some of the big cities, where some bureaucrats in the 50s decided we don't want any further outward growth of these cities.
It is fascinating how much of the green belt, especially around London, is actually concrete, is actually car parks, is actually frankly fly-tipping areas. Yes, it is a grand misnomer, but we don't have all the time in the world. So let's move on to childcare, because this is something that really is more expensive in England specifically compared to many other countries, not least within the United Kingdom. It's cheaper in Scotland, but it's also cheaper in European countries. Why is that?
That is because in most other countries, as used to be the case here, childcare used to be historically a fairly informal arrangement. 20 years ago, most people wouldn't even have thought of it as an industry, but just more like a neighborhood arrangement or family arrangement. You just arrange some way that people look after kids to make sure that they are safe and they have somewhere to play. What happened since then is that the sector has been overly formalized, partly through prescriptive ratios of staff to children. So every carer can only look after a certain number of children, and that is quite strictly capped, and more so here than in most neighbor countries. Although we don't see any difference in safety, it's not that if these stringent ratios somehow got us greater safety standards, then okay, I'd say then maybe they have a point in doing it that way. But that's not what we see. Seems to be just an arbitrary bureaucratic arrangement that drives up cost for no good reason.
Yes, for 2-year-olds, I believe it's 1 to 4, one adult to 4 2-year-olds in this country, or rather I should say in England, whereas in Scotland it's 1 to 5, and in some of the Nordic countries it's about 1 to 10. It's the most extraordinary difference, with no particular difference in safety. How realistic is it that we could achieve some reform here and make the cost of childcare much more affordable?
That is not even unrealistic. I think this was already briefly tried in the coalition years. It's just that the Liberal Democrats at the time were opposed to that, and that's why it didn't happen. But this is not a political taboo subject. In other areas, you run up against greater political constraints, but this isn't something which would in itself be unpopular. So I can't see why that shouldn't happen. And then there's of course also the issue that over time we've turned childcare into effectively a part of the education system, which it wasn't historically. It used to be more like a safe, supervised playground. It didn't have to be a place where you learn a great deal. I mean, that's for later. You can that's for primary school. But that means that a curriculum has been imposed on the sector, and that's also something that drives up costs. But again, I can't see why that should be unreformable politically.